Dusty road stretched out like an open wound across the dry plains of West Texas, a ribbon of caliche and gravel that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at the same time. Heat waves shimmered off the ground, distorting the horizon until the mesquite trees looked like they were dancing in a fever dream. It was the kind of road where a man could lose his way or find his soul, where the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on your chest. That silence was the music of the land, a song older than the asphalt highways and the concrete cities that were slowly eating away at the edges of the frontier. But tonight, miles away from the quiet dignity of that lonely dirt path, the air was not silent. It was vibrating with the artificial thunder of 60,000 screaming fans packed into the NRG Stadium in Houston. The contrast was violent. Outside, the humid Texas night was thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and street vendors. Inside the massive concrete bowl, the air was conditioned to a crisp chill, smelling of expensive perfume, stale beer, and the electric anticipation that only comes when a living legend is about to take the stage. Deep within the bowels of the stadium, in a dressing room that looked more like a hotel suite than a place for a working musician, George Strait sat on a leather sofa that cost more than his first pickup truck. At 71 years old, the king of country looked exactly as the world expected him to look. His Wrangler jeans were starched to a stiffness that could stand on its own. His button-down shirt was pressed with military precision, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine that caught the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. He was the picture of calm, the stoic cowboy who had weathered every storm the music industry had thrown at him for 4 decades. He was the man who never flinched, never broke character, and never let the cracks in his armor show. But tonight the armor was feeling heavy. George stared at his reflection in the large vanity mirror, but he didn't see the superstar. He saw the lines around his eyes that deepened with every year, the gray in his beard that he kept neatly trimmed, and the tiredness that no amount of sleep could wash away. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was a weariness of the soul, a subtle sickness that came from smiling at people who didn't know you and shaking hands with men who saw you as a walking dollar sign rather than a human being. The event tonight was billed as the Frontier Gala, a massive charity concert organized to celebrate the heritage of the American West. The tickets cost a fortune, and the front rows were filled not with the cowboys and ranchers who actually lived the life, but with oil tycoons, real estate moguls, and politicians wearing pristine hats that had never blocked the sun and boots that had never stepped in mud. It was a masquerade ball, a costume party where the rich played cowboy for a night while the real cowboys were out there on that dusty road, struggling to keep the lights on. George knew this. He had known it when he signed the contract, but the check was massive, and the organizers had promised that the proceeds would go towards rural development and preserving historical agricultural sites. He had told himself it was for the greater good. He had told himself that he was using his fame to help the people who mattered. He was wrong. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the air conditioning and the muffled bass of the opening act vibrating through the walls. George reached for his black resistal hat, the crown of his kingdom, preparing to put on the mask one more time. But before his hand could touch the felt brim, his phone buzzed on the glass table. It was a harsh, jarring sound in the stillness. George frowned. Few people had this private number. His family, his manager, and a handful of friends from a life that existed before the platinum records and the stadium tours. He glanced at the screen, expecting a good luck message from his son or a logistical update from his tour manager. The name on the screen made his heart stop for a fraction of a second. Martha. The name brought with it a flood of sensory memories so vivid they made him dizzy. He could smell the strong black coffee brewing in an old percolator on a wood-burning stove. He could feel the rough texture of a braided rope in his young, blistered hands. He could hear the deep, booming laugh of a man named Heavy, Martha's late husband, the man who had taught George that a horse knows when you're afraid, so you better not be. Martha was the matriarch of the Double Creek Ranch, a sprawling piece of history nestled in the hill country, a place where George had spent his teenage summers learning that being a cowboy wasn't about the clothes you wore, but about the word you kept. He hadn't seen Martha in 5 years. The road had kept him busy, and shamefully he had let the visits become phone calls and the phone calls become Christmas cards. He swiped the screen to unlock it, his calloused thumb hovering over the message icon. It wasn't a text. It was a picture. George leaned in, squinting slightly. The image was grainy, taken in the dark. illuminated only by the harsh blue and red flashing lights of a police cruiser. It showed a wooden fence post, weathered and grey, a post George himself had helped replace 40 years ago. Nailed to the wood was a bright orange piece of paper, stark and violent against the rustic background. It was an eviction notice, a foreclosure warning. Below the image there was a short block of text. George read it, and the air in the room seemed to vanish. George, they came tonight. The sheriff said he had no choice. They said the land belongs to Titan Development now. They are bringing the bulldozers at dawn to tear down the barn. The same logo that is on your concert poster is on the paper nailed to my door. I don't know what to do. I have nowhere to go. Goodbye. George read it again. 1, 2, 3 times. The words Titan Development burned into his retinas. He looked up, his eyes darting to the VIP laminate pass sitting on the table next to his guitar picks. The pass was gold and black, embossed with the sponsor's logo. A stylized, aggressive T inside a cogwheel. Titan Development, the primary sponsor of the Frontier Gala. The people paying his fee tonight. The people who were currently standing in the VIP box, drinking champagne, and waiting for him to sing about the beauty of the Texas lifestyle while they actively destroyed it. A cold wave of nausea rolled through his stomach. His hands, usually steady as a rock, began to tremble. It wasn't fear. It was a rage so pure, so hot, and so volcanic that it threatened to shatter his composure completely. He felt like he had been punched in the gut by his own ignorance. He was the headliner for the executioners of his own past. He was the distraction, the shiny object dangling in front of the public while the thieves looted the house out back. He set the phone down, but the image of that orange paper on Martha's fence remained seared in his mind. He stood up, pacing the small room. He felt trapped. The walls, covered in black drapes to dampen the sound, felt like the walls of a coffin. He thought of Martha, 72 years old, a widow who had buried her husband on that land, a woman who had fed him when he was broke and encouraged him when he was nobody. She was alone out there in the dark, watching the flashing lights of the law enforce the greed of a corporation, while he sat here in air-conditioned luxury, preparing to sing Amarillo by Morning for the very men signing the order. The door to the dressing room swung open without a knock. The sound was intrusive, arrogant. George stopped pacing and turned, his face a mask of stone. Walking in was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a boardroom. Carter Sterling, the CEO of Titan Development, filled the doorway. He was a tall man, handsome in a predatory way, wearing a tuxedo that cost more than the Double Creek Ranch made in a decade. He held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand and a lit cigar in the other, ignoring the no-smoking signs that plastered the hallway. Behind him, a gaggle of younger executives and investors hovered like pilot fish around a shark, all grinning with that vacant, hungry look of people who measure worth in stock options. "George, my man," Sterling boomed, his voice loud and overly familiar. He stepped into the room as if he owned it, and in a way tonight he thought he did. "You ready to blow the roof off this place? We've got the governor in the box. The investors are ecstatic. This is going to be the biggest night in Houston history." George didn't move. He didn't extend his hand. He stood by the vanity table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the wood. He looked at Sterling, really looked at him, and saw the emptiness behind the smile. He saw a man who would pave over a cemetery if it meant adding a zero to his quarterly earnings. "Mr. Sterling," George said, his voice low, a rumble of thunder before the storm. It wasn't the polite drawl he usually used with sponsors. It was flat, hard, and dangerous. "Please, call me Carter. We're partners tonight, George. We're saving the West, right?" Sterling laughed, taking a sip of his champagne. He gestured to the room with his cigar. "Look, I just wanted to bring the boys down to meet the legend before you go out there. We're talking about a massive expansion next year. We're buying up huge tracts of land in the hill country, undeveloped, wasted space. We're going to turn it into luxury ranchettes. The George Strait country experience, maybe. We could talk licensing." The words hit George like physical blows. Wasted space. That was what they called Martha's home. That was what they called the soil where Heavy was buried. That was what they called the pastures, where George had learned the rhythm of a gallop. Luxury ranchettes for people who wanted the aesthetic of the cowboy life without the dirt, the sweat, or the soul. George looked down at his phone again. The screen had gone dark, but the message was still there, waiting. He looked back at Sterling. "You're buying land in the hill country?" George asked, his voice barely a whisper. Aggressively, Sterling bragged, missing the tone completely. "We just closed on a few legacy properties today. Some old-timers holding out, you know how it is. Stubborn. But everyone has a price or a breaking point. We have a great legal team. We clean up the titles, move the old structures out and bring in the infrastructure. It's progress, George. It's the future. Progress." George felt the bile rise in his throat. He looked at the cowboy hat sitting on the table. The white resistal. It was a symbol of honor, a symbol of a code. You don't lie. You don't steal. You look a man in the eye. You help your neighbor. If he put that hat on now and walked out onto that stage to sing for this man, the hat would be nothing more than a costume. He would be nothing more than a clown in a rodeo, dancing while the bulls trampled the things he loved. "Get out," George said. The room went silent. The smile on Sterling's face faltered, twitching at the corners. "Excuse me?" I said. "Get out of my dressing room," George repeated, louder this time. The volume didn't rise much, but the intensity doubled. He turned fully toward the CEO, his blue eyes piercing through the cloud of cigar smoke. Sterling laughed nervously, looking back at his investors. He thought it was a joke, a quirky artist moment. "Come on, George. Don't be like that. We're on the same team. We're paying you $500,000 for 90 minutes of work. I think that buys me a little hospitality." George reached out and picked up the VIP pass with the Titan logo. He looked at it for a second, then crushed it in his hand, the plastic snapping with a sharp crack. He tossed the crumpled remains onto the floor at Sterling's polished dress shoes. "We are not on the same team," George said, stepping forward. The pilot fish behind Sterling took a step back, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. "You think because you write a check, you own the man? You think because you put on a hat, you know what it means to work the land?" Sterling's face hardened. The charm evaporated, replaced by the cold steel of a corporate bully. "Look, I don't know what bug crawled up your ass, Straight, but you have a contract. You step on that stage in 10 minutes, or my lawyers will own everything you have, down to the guitar strings. You don't want to play hardball with Titan. We eat little legacy acts for breakfast." George smiled then. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just realized he had nothing left to lose, because the only thing that mattered was already being taken away. He thought of the dusty road. He thought of the silence. He thought of Martha crying in the dark. "I don't play hardball, son," George said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that echoed with the weight of decades. "I play country music, and country music is about the truth, something you wouldn't recognize if it bit you." Sterling sneered, adjusting his jacket. "You're a performer. Perform, that's what we paid for. The crowd is waiting. Don't be a fool." He turned on his heel, motioning for his entourage to follow. "We'll be watching from the box. Make it good. Or else." They left, slamming the door behind them. The silence rushed back in, but now it was charged with electricity. George stood alone in the center of the room. His heart was pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at the closed door, then back at his phone. The tour manager, a frantic man named Eddie with a headset permanently attached to his ear, burst in a second later. He looked pale. "Boss, what happened?" Sterling looked like he wanted to kill someone. "We have 2 minutes. The house lights are going down. The intro video is rolling. We need to go. Now." George didn't move toward the door. He walked back to the table and picked up his phone. He looked at the picture of the eviction notice one last time. He thought about the $500,000 check. He thought about the lawsuit Sterling threatened. He thought about the 60,000 fans screaming his name, innocent people who just wanted to hear the songs that made them cry and fall in love. If he walked away, Sterling won. Sterling would sue him, destroy his reputation, and Martha would still lose the ranch. The narrative would be that George Strait was a diva who walked out on a charity event. Titan Development would spin it, and they would keep crushing the little guys in the dark. But if he went out there and sang, he was an accomplice. Eddie was practically vibrating with anxiety. George, please, we have to move. The band is on stage. The click track starts in 60 seconds. George Strait took a deep breath. He picked up his hat. He ran his fingers along the brim, feeling the felt. He placed it on his head, pulling it down low over his eyes. He turned to Eddie, and for the first time that night, there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. It was the look of a man who had just decided to burn the bridge while he was still standing on it. "I'm not walking away, Eddie," George said, grabbing his acoustic guitar. "Oh, thank God," Eddie exhaled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Okay, let's go. Set list A, right? Write this down to open." George walked past him, heading for the hallway that led to the stage. The roar of the crowd grew louder with every step, a physical force shaking the concrete floor. He stopped at the edge of the tunnel, where the darkness met the blinding light of the arena. He tightened his grip on the neck of his guitar. "No," George said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Scratch the set list. Tell the boys to kill the intro music." Eddie froze. "What? George, we can't—" "Kill it," George commanded. "I'm going out there alone." "And Eddie?" "Yeah, boss. Make sure the video team has a feed from my phone. I'm going to need to show them something." George didn't wait for an answer. He walked up the ramp, into the blinding lights, into the roar of the beast, carrying a weapon that Carter Sterling never saw coming. The truth. The dusty road had led him here, to this moment, and he was about to turn the biggest stage in Texas into a courtroom. The walk from the dressing room to the stage was a journey through a canyon of noise and organized chaos. George moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, his boots striking the concrete floor with a rhythmic thud that seemed to sync with the pounding of his own heart. He passed roadies pushing flight cases, lighting technicians shouting into headsets, and security guards who nodded with reverence as he passed. Usually, George would nod back, flash a quick smile, acknowledge the army of people it took to make a show happen. Tonight, he saw none of them. His vision was tunneled, focused entirely on the pool of light waiting at the top of the ramp. He felt like a man walking to the gallows, or perhaps a man walking to stop an execution. The weight of the phone in his pocket felt heavier than the guitar strapped across his back. It was a digital anchor, dragging him down into the reality he could no longer ignore. As he reached the side of the stage, the ace in the whole band was already in position. They were his brothers in arms, men who had stood beside him for decades, through fairgrounds and stadiums, through tragedies and triumphs. Mike, his steel guitar player, looked over and gave a thumbs up, ready to launch into the opening riff of the first song. But the smile on Mike's face faltered when he saw George's eyes. There was no sparkle there, no pre-show adrenaline. There was only a cold, hard resolve that looked frighteningly like grief. George walked past the drum riser, past the fiddle player who was rosining his bow, and approached the center stage. The moment he stepped into the spotlight, the stadium erupted. It was a physical wall of sound, a roar that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. 60,000 people jumped to their feet, a sea of cowboy hats and illuminated smartphones, screaming his name. George, George, George. It was the sound of adoration, of love, of a connection that spanned generations. Under normal circumstances, this sound was his fuel. It was the drug that kept him touring when his body wanted to rest. But tonight, the roar sounded like a scream for help. It sounded like Martha's voice amplified 60,000 times. These people were cheering for the idea of the cowboy, for the myth of the West, unaware that the very ground beneath that myth was being sold off by the men in the luxury suites. George walked to the microphone stand. He didn't unstrap his guitar. He didn't strum a chord to check the tuning. He simply stood there, his hands resting on the microphone, his head bowed slightly so the brim of his white hat cast a shadow over his face. The band, sensing something was wrong, hesitated. The drummer held his sticks in mid-air. The bass player looked at the stage manager in the wings, who was frantically speaking into his comms. The cue for the opening song came and went. The giant screens behind the stage, which were supposed to be playing a high-energy montage of George's greatest hits, remained black. The crowd began to notice. The roar wavered, transforming from a unified cheer into a confused murmur that rippled through the stands like a wave. Why wasn't he playing? Was he sick? Was something wrong? The silence spread from the front row to the nosebleed seats, a heavy, expectant hush that was far more terrifying than the noise had been. George slowly lifted his head. The giant jumbotron screens captured his face in high definition. Every wrinkle, every pore, the steeliness in his blue eyes was projected 40 feet high for the world to see. He looked tired. He looked angry. He looked human. He leaned into the microphone. The sound of his breath amplified, echoed through the cavernous stadium. "I was going to start tonight with a song about the seashores of old Mexico," George said. His voice was deep, steady, but lacking its usual melodic warmth. "It was the voice of a grandfather telling you that you had done something very wrong. But I can't do that, not tonight." A ripple of whispers broke out. People exchanged glances. Was he retiring? Was this it? Up in the VIP box, encased in glass and luxury, Carter Sterling frowned. He set his champagne glass down on the marble counter. "What is he doing?" Sterling asked, his voice tight. "This isn't the script. Why isn't the music playing? We have a timeline. The governor has to leave by 10. "Back on stage," George continued, ignoring the confusion. He looked out into the darkness, trying to find individual faces in the front row. He saw a young couple holding hands. He saw an old man in a veteran's cap. He saw a little girl on her father's shoulders. "You know," George said, gripping the mic stand until his knuckles turned white, "we talk a lot about the cowboy way. We sing about it. We wear the hats. We wear the boots. We pay good money to come to places like this and feel a part of it. And that's good. That's fine. But being a cowboy isn't about the clothes. It isn't about the truck you drive. It's about knowing the difference between right and wrong. And it's about standing your ground when the wind tries to blow you over." He paused. The silence was absolute now. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. "I got a message tonight," George said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out his smartphone. The sight of the king of country holding a cell phone on stage was so incongruous that a nervous titter ran through the crowd. "Before I walked out here, I was sitting in the back, getting ready to entertain you. And I got this." He turned to the side of the stage, signaling the video director. "Put it on the screen, son, the feed now." The video director, a young man named Kevin who had grown up listening to George Strait on his grandfather's knee, didn't hesitate. He bypassed the scheduled graphics, bypassed the sponsor loops, and patched the direct feed from George's phone onto the massive LED walls that dominated the stadium. Suddenly, the 60-foot image of George's face was replaced. The stadium was illuminated by the stark, grainy photo of the rotting fence post. The orange eviction notice glowed like a radioactive warning sign. The flashing blue and red lights in the photo gave it a sinister, tragic quality. The logo of Titan Development, the jagged T inside the cogwheel, was clearly visible on the document. A collective gasp went through the arena. It was the sound of 60,000 people realizing that the show was over, and real life had just crashed the party. "This," George said, pointing a trembling finger at the screen behind him, "this is the Double Creek Ranch. It's about 3 hours from where we are standing right now. It's not a fancy place. It doesn't have a swimming pool. It doesn't have a paved driveway, but it has heart." He took a step back from the mic, pacing a small circle before returning. He needed to control his voice. He needed to keep the tears that were stinging his eyes from falling. Cowboys don't cry on stage. But tonight, he was close. 40 years ago, George continued, his voice softer now, more intimate, "I was a young man who didn't know much about anything. I met a woman named Martha and her husband, Heavy. They took me in. They taught me how to rope. They taught me how to mend a fence. They fed me when I was hungry. They didn't ask for rent. They didn't ask for a percentage of my future. They just did it, because that's what neighbors do. That's what people of the land do." He looked up at the screen again, staring at the eviction notice. Heavy passed away 10 years ago. Martha is 72. She lives alone. She has arthritis in her hands so bad she can barely hold a coffee cup, let alone a rifle to defend her home. And tonight, while I'm standing here wearing a tuxedo jacket getting ready to sing songs about the beauty of Texas, the police are at her gate. The crowd was stunned. Some people were crying. Others were filming with their phones, sensing that history was happening. The anger in the room began to simmer, a low-frequency vibration. George took a deep breath, and the sadness in his face hardened into granite. "They are evicting her," he stated flatly. "Tonight. Right now. Because a corporation found a loophole in an old deed. Because they want to bulldoze her barn, the barn where I wrote my first song, and turn it into a parking lot for a luxury resort." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in. "And the company doing this, the company that is throwing an old woman out into the dirt in the middle of the night, is the same company whose name is on your ticket stubs." The reaction was instantaneous. A murmur of shock turned into a rumble of outrage. People looked at their tickets. They looked at the banners hanging from the rafters. Titan Development, building the future. The irony was a bitter pill, and George had just forced them to swallow it. In the VIP box, panic had set in. Carter Sterling was on his feet, his face a mask of purple rage. "Cut the mic," he screamed at his assistants. "Cut the damn sound. Get him off the stage. This is a breach of contract. This is slander." But the sound engineer, a grizzly veteran who had been with George since 1985, crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't touching a thing. Nobody cut George Strait's mic. Not on his watch. George wasn't finished. He unstrapped his guitar and set it on the stand. He didn't need it. His voice was the only instrument he needed now. He walked to the edge of the stage, peering through the blinding lights, looking up towards the ring of luxury suites that circled the arena like a crown of thorns. "I know you're up there, Mr. Sterling," George boomed. He didn't need to shout. The microphone carried his authority to every corner of the building. "I know you're drinking your champagne. I know you're celebrating the acquisition of assets." He pointed. One long, accusatory finger aimed directly at the glass-fronted box where the Titan executives were scrambling like cockroaches exposed to the light. The camera operators, sensing the drama, swung the house cameras around. The image on the Jumbotron cut from the eviction notice to a live shot of the VIP box. There, frozen in high definition, was Carter Sterling, phone to his ear, looking terrified. The crowd booed. It was a guttural, ugly sound, 60,000 people turning on the villain. "You told me backstage that this is progress," George said, addressing the image on the screen. "You told me that land was wasted space. You told me that everyone has a price." George reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was his contract for the night. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately. "Well, you're right about one thing, Carter. Everyone has a price, but some things aren't for sale. My integrity isn't for sale, and Martha's home isn't for sale." He held the contract up. "This piece of paper says you are paying me $500,000 to be here tonight. That's a lot of money. That's more money than Martha has seen in her entire life." George looked at the paper, then at the camera. "I don't want your money. I don't want a dime of it. In fact, I think it's dirty." He ripped the contract in half. The sound of the tearing paper was amplified by the microphone, a sharp rip that echoed like a gunshot. He tore it again and again until the confetti of legal jargon fell to the stage floor. "But here is what we are going to do," George said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming deadly serious. "I am going to make a donation. Right now. I am donating the full amount of my fee, $500,000, to the legal defense fund of the Double Creek Ranch. And if that's not enough, I'll double it. And if that's not enough, I'll sell every guitar I own." The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't just noise. It was a war cry. They were on his side. They were ready to fight. "But money takes time," George said, cutting through the applause. "And Martha doesn't have time. The bulldozers are coming at dawn. So, Mr. Sterling, we are going to handle this the old-fashioned way. The Texas way." George stepped closer to the edge of the stage. He looked dangerous. The grandfatherly warmth was gone, replaced by the cold resolve of a man who had stared down bulls and blizzards. "I am not going to sing a single note until you pick up that phone, call your sheriff and call off the dogs. I want to hear you say it. I want to see the proof." Or, he let the word hang there. Or, "I am going to walk out of this stadium. And I'm not walking to my bus, I'm walking to my truck. And I'm driving to Double Creek, and I'm inviting every single person in this building to come with me." The stadium shook. The floorboards vibrated. It was a stampede waiting to happen. "There are 60,000 of us, Carter," George said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "That's a lot of witnesses. That's a lot of traffic. I don't think your bulldozers can get through 60,000 people standing arm in arm singing The Chair. Do you?" He crossed his arms and stood there, silent, waiting. The ball was in Sterling's court. The pressure was unimaginable. On the giant screen, Sterling looked like a trapped animal. He was sweating profusely. He was shouting at someone on his phone, gesturing wildly. The governor, who had been sitting next to him, had already quietly slipped out of the back of the suite, not wanting to be associated with political suicide. The standoff stretched on. Seconds felt like hours. The crowd began to chant, "Save the ranch! Save the ranch!" It started in the cheap seats and washed down like a tidal wave, crashing against the glass of the VIP box. George didn't move. He didn't check his watch. He just stared up at that box, his eyes locking onto Sterling's soul across the distance. He was gambling everything. His career, his assets, his freedom. If he incited a riot, he could go to jail. But as he stood there, he felt a strange sense of peace. He could hear Heavy's voice in his head. "A man who stands for nothing will fall for anything, George." He was standing. and he wasn't going to move until the mountain moved first. Suddenly, on the big screen, there was movement. Sterling slammed his hand on the table. He looked defeated. He held his phone up, showing the screen to the camera. It was a call screen. He was dialing. He said something to his assistant, who ran to the front of the box and frantically waved a white napkin. It was a surrender. George saw it. He didn't smile, not yet. He raised a hand and the 60,000 people fell silent instantly, obedient to their king. "Bring me a phone," George said to the stage manager. "A landline. Put it through the PA. I want to hear the call." A tech scurried out with a wireless handset, connecting it to the system. George took it. He looked up at the box. "Dial the sheriff, Carter. Put it on speaker. We're all listening." The tension was so thick it was suffocating. The entire stadium was holding its breath, waiting for the electronic ring that would decide the fate of a widow 300 miles away. This was no longer a concert. It was a public trial, and George Strait was the judge, jury, and executioner. The electronic trill of a phone ringing echoed through the massive stadium, a sound usually associated with annoyance in a movie theater, but now it sounded like the tolling of a judgment bell. The audio feed from the VIP box was patchy, filled with static and the desperate shuffling of papers, but when the connection clicked open, the silence in the arena was absolute. 60,000 people leaned forward as one, straining to hear the voice of the law 300 miles away. "Sheriff Miller," a gruff, tired voice crackled through the massive speaker towers. The sheriff sounded like he was standing in the wind, likely out by the gate of the Double Creek Ranch, watching the headlights of the bulldozers cut through the darkness. Carter Sterling, projected on the jumbotron, held the phone with a hand that shook visibly. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, with the rope already around his neck. He licked his dry lips, his eyes darting to the camera that was broadcasting his humiliation to the world. "Sheriff, it's Carter Sterling," the CEO stammered. His voice was thin, stripped of all its corporate bravado. "Mr. Sterling," the sheriff sounded confused. "We're moving on the property now. The old lady is refusing to open the gate, but we have the bolt cutters. Do you want us to proceed with the extraction?" A low, menacing growl rose from the crowd, a sound of pure, protective fury. George Strait didn't say a word. He just tapped the face of his watch and raised an eyebrow at the screen. The message was clear. "Fix it, now." "No," Sterling shouted, too loud, his voice cracking. "No, Sheriff. Stand down. Do not cut the lock. Do not enter the property." "Sir?" The sheriff sounded annoyed now. "I have a court order here signed by Judge Higgins. You told me to have this cleared by morning." "I am rescinding the order," Sterling said, sweating profusely. "Pull your men back. Pull the equipment back. The eviction is cancelled. Indefinitely. I need that in writing, mister." "Sterling," the sheriff said, the skepticism dripping from his voice, "I'm not playing games out here in the dirt." George leaned into his microphone on stage. "You heard the man, Sheriff," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting into the call. "This is George Strait. I'm standing here with 60,000 witnesses who just heard Mr. Sterling cancel the operation. If you touch that gate, you're not just violating a new order, you're answering to me." There was a long pause on the line. The static hissed. Then a different tone entered the sheriff's voice, a tone of recognition and perhaps relief. "Mr. Strait," the sheriff asked. "Well, if the king says stand down, we stand down. Boys, pack it up. We're going home." The sound of the call ending was swallowed instantly by a roar that threatened to blow the roof off NRG Stadium. It wasn't just applause. It was a seismic event. Strangers hugged each other in the aisles. Cowboy hats were thrown into the air. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt small against a giant, for every family that had lost a home to a bank, for every acre of land that had been paved over by greed. On the screen, Carter Sterling slumped into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was a ruined man, and he knew it. His stock price would plummet by morning. His reputation was ash. He signaled to his security team, and they hustled him out of the box like a criminal fleeing a crime scene, disappearing into the shadows of the stadium corridors. George stood center stage, bathed in the white spotlight. He didn't pump his fist. He didn't jump around. He simply took off his hat, wiped his brow, and placed it back on his head. He looked at the phone in his hand, then at the camera. "Thank you," he whispered. He turned to the band. The musicians were grinning ear to ear, energized by the raw electricity in the room. They didn't need a set list anymore. They knew exactly what to do. "Boys," George said, picking up his guitar and strumming a G chord that rang out like a church bell. "Let's play some country music." The fiddle player launched into the opening riff of Heartland, and the energy in the stadium shifted from tension to pure, unadulterated joy. George sang with a fire that hadn't been there in a decade. His voice was rich, powerful, and laced with the grit of the victory he had just won. He wasn't singing for a paycheck anymore. He was singing for Martha. He was singing for the land. He was singing because it was the only way to release the adrenaline coursing through his veins. For 2 hours, George Strait held court. He played the hits, he played the deep cuts, and he told stories. He turned the massive arena into a honky-tonk. When he finally closed the show with "The Cowboy Rides Away," there wasn't a dry eye in the house. As he walked off the stage, waving to the crowd, he left behind more than just music. He left a legacy of courage. 3 weeks later, the Texas sun was rising over the hill country, painting the sky in streaks of violet and burnt orange. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and cedar. The dusty road leading to the Double Creek Ranch was quiet, save for the crunch of tires, as a black pickup truck made its way up the long driveway. George Strait parked the truck near the old barn. The structure was still standing, its weathered wood glowing in the morning light. The fence, the one that had held the eviction notice, had been repaired. The orange paper was gone. In its place was a new hand-painted sign, "Private Property." Protected by the grace of God and the stubbornness of friends. George stepped out of the truck, carrying a bag of donuts and 2 coffees. He walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking familiarly under his boots. Martha was sitting in her rocking chair, wrapped in a knitted shawl. She looked older than he remembered, her face a map of the worries she had carried, but her eyes were bright. Beside her sat a young lawyer, a sharp woman from Austin who George had hired to ensure Titan development never came within 10 miles of this property again. "You're late," Martha said, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Traffic was murder," George quipped, handing her a coffee. "Had to wait for a herd of cattle to cross the road." Martha took the cup, her trembling hands steadied by George's gentle grip. She looked at him, and the humor faded from her face, replaced by a profound emotion that words couldn't quite capture. "They sent a letter," Martha said softly. "The company. They apologized. Said it was a clerical error." "Clerical error," George scoffed, leaning against the porch railing. "That's a fancy way of saying they got caught." "The lawyer says the deed is secure," Martha continued. "She says with the trust fund you set up, the taxes are paid for the next 100 years. This land, it's going to stay Double Creek forever. It's going to be a sanctuary." George looked out over the pastures. He could see the spot where Heavy used to teach him how to throw a lasso. He could see the tree where he had kissed his first girlfriend. He could see the ghosts of his own past dancing in the tall grass. "It was never about the money, Martha," George said quietly. "It was about remembering who we are." Martha reached out and took his hand. Her skin was like paper, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You risked everything, George, your tour, your reputation. Why?" George looked down at his boots. He thought about the stadium. He thought about the roar of the crowd. But mostly, he thought about the silence of the dressing room before he made the decision. "Because a cowboy is only as good as his word," he said, "and I promised Heavy I'd look out for you." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, burning off the morning mist. The world outside was still chaotic. Corporations were still greedy. Politicians were still lying, and the cities were still encroaching on the frontier. But here, on this patch of dirt at the end of a dusty road, order had been restored. George finished his coffee and stood up. He adjusted his hat. "I got to get going, Martha. I've got a studio session in Nashville tomorrow." "You go on," she said, shooing him away. "Go sing your songs, but don't be a stranger." "Never again," George promised. He walked back to his truck, the gravel crunching under his feet. As he opened the door, he looked back at the house. Martha was waving. The barn stood tall. The land breathed. George climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need to. The melody was already there, in the hum of the tires on the dirt, in the wind rushing through the open window, in the beating of his own heart. He pulled out onto the main road, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake, a solitary figure moving through a changing world, armed with nothing but a guitar and the unshakable knowledge that some things are worth fighting for. He drove toward the horizon, just a man in a truck, but to the people of Double Creek and to 60,000 souls in Houston, he was something more. He was the proof that even when the lights go down and the music stops, the song remains the same.